The night Margaret died, the rain wouldn't stop. It hammered against the hospital windows like a warning, like a secret begging to be told. I should have felt sorrow. Instead, I felt relief. And then shame for feeling it. But nothing could prepare me for the letter waiting in her locked drawer. The words that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and the woman who hated me most. I remember the day Margaret died, as if my heart has recorded every passing second in a hushed, mournful echo. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see the sun filtering through her bedroom curtains, painting the walls in soft gold, a color that felt much too gentle for the storm that was about to break over our lives. She had been battling cancer for months, but in those final days, the disease claimed her with startling quickness. Watching her weaken frightened me more than I ever cared to admit. I was never particularly close to her. She had made sure of that. But she was still James's mother. And somehow, I believed there would always be time to bridge the chasm between us. There wasn't. After her passing, I found myself in that same bedroom, forever cast in half light, as though Margaret had taken the brightness with her. The house was eerily silent, each step echoing more loudly than it should have. I hesitated at the threshold of the room, heart pounding, recalling 1,000 awkward memories. Margaret scowling at me during family dinners. Margaret glaring whenever I tried to help with the dishes. Margaret's cold ice whenever she reminded me that I would never be good enough for her son. Even in death, I felt her presence looming, as though her spirit hovered, disapproving in every corner. When I opened the top drawer of the mahogany dresser, the one she always kept locked, I expected maybe some old photographs or a sentimental trinket she was particularly protective of. Instead, I found a single envelope. Its edges looked worn, as if she'd handled it many times, deciding whether to destroy it or leave it behind. The words scrawled across the envelope in jagged script read, "To the daughter-in-law I hated most." My stomach twisted. The shock of those words nearly made me drop the envelope. On one level, I already knew she hated me. Margaret had never been subtle about her feelings, but to see the hatred spelled out like that, final and irreversible, shook me. I swallowed against a tightness in my throat. For a few minutes, I simply stared at the envelope. Part of me wanted to rip it to shreds, to throw it away, and never learn whatever final barb she had left behind. But a deeper part of me, a trembling, anxious curiosity, needed to know. The words inside might close the gap of my own confusion, or they might deepen the wound forever. Still, I tucked it into my bag and walked out, heart rattling in my chest. I did not open it that day. I was terrified of Margaret's last word. The funeral came sooner than I could prepare for. St. Michael's Church, with its looming spires and stained glass windows, stood against the backdrop of a grey sky. Rain pelted the coloured glass, making it look as though the saints and angels depicted there were weeping alongside us. People huddled in the pews, dark umbrellas collapsing near the entrance, water pooling at their feet. I took my seat next to James. Even in his darkest suit, he looked small. My hand found his, and I felt him squeeze so tightly, I feared he might break my bones. His eyes glimmered with tears he kept fighting to hold back. I glanced around, taking measure of who had shown up to pay respects. A few of Margaret's old friends from her work at the community centre, some extended family, their faces carved with pain or simply numb. And then, across the aisle, I saw Emily, James's ex-mistress, in a bold crimson dress that broke every unspoken rule of funeral attire. The colour was so loud, so jarring, that it felt like an insult hurled at a mourning crowd. Emily caught my eye and smirked, pressing her lips together in a twisted smile. Every time I saw her, it felt like a slap. But to see her at Margaret's funeral, seemingly reveling in her presence, stoked a rage I could barely contain. I gripped the unopened letter in my purse, as if by holding it I could keep myself grounded. James took to the pulpit to deliver the eulogy. He cleared his throat, shoulders shaking. She was my rock, he began, voice cracking on every syllable. She was the one who taught me to stand up for myself, to be strong. She was everything I ever wanted to be. His words faltered, and tears slipped down his cheeks. That was when I realized how much it hurt him to lose the mother he believed was his flesh and blood. The mother whose approval he had sought his entire life. In that moment, my resentment toward Margaret softened a fraction, just enough for me to recognize that despite her cruelty to me, she'd been a fierce force in James's life. Back at the graveside, the rain continued to assault our umbrellas, the ground turning slick under our feet. Mud splattered my shoes, but I was too numb to care. The coffin was lowered into the earth, and I felt James's breath hitch beside me. Emily lingered a few steps away, but I tried to shut out the thought of her. Then, unable to resist any longer, I opened the envelope. Anna, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you've won. But know this, James isn't my blood. I found him in a cardboard box outside a liquor store. His real mother was a crack addict. I took him in because I couldn't bear children after the beatings. You think I'm cruel? You, who stole the only child I ever had. You deserve every misery. My eyes widened, hands trembling so violently, I nearly dropped the letter. There, at Margaret's funeral, I was learning a secret that made the ground tilt beneath me. James wasn't her biological son. Everything he'd believed about himself was a lie. I felt my knees buckle, and darkness threatened the edges of my vision. Somehow, I forced myself to remain upright, not wanting to create more spectacle than we already had with Emily's dress and James's broken sobs. But my mind reeled. If James wasn't Margaret's blood, if she had adopted him, or stolen him, or found him, her words were so brutally vague. What would this revelation do to my husband's already fragile heart? I didn't say anything to James that moment. The funeral was too raw, and he was already grieving. The letter burned in my hands like a live grenade, promising to explode our life once I revealed its contents. After the ceremony, once we were back home, I sat on our couch in the dim light of the living room, hearing the patter of rain on the roof. My phone buzzed with condolences from extended family, but I just stared at the floor. When James walked in, tie askew, eyes rimmed in red, I felt tears fill my own eyes. "There's something I have to show you," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain. He took the letter, read it, and recoiled as if the paper burned his skin. "Lies!" he shouted, hurling his whiskey glass into the fireplace with a violent crash. Shards sparkled across the hearth. "You're trying to destroy her memory." His breath came in ragged gasps, denial etched onto every feature. "No," I said, voice shaking. "Read it. She hated me because she thought I'd take you away from her. But this, she's saying you were never hers to begin with." It physically hurt to watch him tear up the letter and clutch the pieces in his hand. The grief and shock contorted his face. My husband, my rock, was crumbling before me. "I don't understand," he whispered. "How could I not be hers? All these years, she insisted I looked just like my father. She told me I had her mother's eyes. Anna." His voice broke into a sob. "Who am I?" The thunder boomed outside, matching the jagged rhythm of my pulse. I didn't know how to comfort him. Only one thing came to mind. Margaret, ironically, had always loved Psalm 121. She would mutter it under her breath when storms raged outside, or when finances were tight, or whenever she thought I wasn't listening. I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? I tried to whisper the words now, searching for some bit of solace, but they tasted like ash in my mouth. There was no comfort, no immediate deliverance. Only the stinging reality that everything was different now. James turned away from me and pressed his forehead against the wall. His shoulders shook. The letter's words had cut deep, and I sensed that a fissure had opened in our marriage. This was bigger than just a mother's cruelty. This was an existential crisis, one that threatened to uproot everything he believed about himself, about his family, about what it meant to be a son. I approached him carefully, rubbing gentle circles on his back. I could feel the tension in his muscles, as though he might bolt at any moment, run from me and the betrayal Margaret had left behind. We stood like that for a long time, listening to the storm batter our windows, neither of us able to form a coherent sentence that might bridge the swirling chaos around us. The next few days were a blur of funeral arrangements and calls from the lawyer. I barely slept. At night, I would drift off for a few minutes, only to dream of a cardboard box in some dark alley, water leaking in from all sides, with a baby crying softly inside. Then I'd wake up, heart pounding, feeling James stirring next to me. He would wake too, nightmares etched across his face, though we never spoke of them. We just held each other under the blankets, connected by the shared anxiety that Margaret had sowed in our lives. When the day of the will reading arrived, we gathered in a small conference room at the law office. The walls smelled of stale coffee, and the overhead fluorescent light buzzed faintly. I had a pit in my stomach, knowing the reading of Margaret's last wishes would surely be laced with the same bitterness she'd carried through life. James sat next to me, shoulders rigid. Across the table, Emily drummed her manicured nails on the polished wood. She didn't bother hiding her triumphant smirk. Ever since the funeral, she'd been circling like a vulture. her gaze fixed on James's distress. Margaret left her entire estate to her grandchildren, the lawyer announced, glancing up from the papers. Contingent on James passing a DNA test to establish that he is in fact her biological son, Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Save your money," she declared, heels clacking as she stepped forward. "I have proof James isn't hers." With a flourish, she dropped a faded newspaper clipping on the table. The date read 1988, the year James was supposedly born. The headline, "Abandoned infant found outside local liquor store." My stomach lurched. The lawyer's eyes flicked toward Emily. "Where did you—" "None of your concern," she snapped. Then she turned to James, venom in her gaze. "You ruined my life. Now it's my turn." I felt protective rage swell in me like a tidal wave. Before I could say anything, James stood. "Why now?" he whispered. "My mother, Margaret, she's gone. What do you gain from this?" Emily shrugged with a feigned innocence that only stoked my anger. "This is just the beginning," she said. "You think you can cheat me out of everything? You have no idea." In the car afterward, James stared out the window, silent as the city blurred past. I tried to find words, but I didn't know how to navigate the venom Emily had just unleashed. We had known for a while that she held a grudge, that she blamed James for, well, many things. But the extent of her vendetta startled me. It was as though she took pleasure in attacking his identity when he was most vulnerable. That night, I found myself climbing the fire escape to the rooftop of our Brooklyn apartment. The metal rungs were slick from recent rain, and the city lights pulsed below, indifferent to my turmoil. In one hand, I clutched Margaret's letter. In the other, a printout of Psalm 121. I don't know why I brought them up there, only that something inside me screamed for a higher vantage point, a place to look out and see if God would answer me from the heavens. Because down here, on the ground, all I felt was confusion and betrayal. I stepped onto the flat rooftop, the wind catching my hair. "Where's your help, God?" I shouted, ignoring the curious glances of a neighbor who'd come up to smoke a cigarette on the far side. My voice echoed against the brick walls. I tried to recite the comforting words of the psalm, but they refused to come. All that came was anger. Was everything a lie? The memory of Margaret's voice suddenly slipped into my mind. It was from when James was just a toddler, maybe 3 years old, and Margaret was crouched next to him, teaching him to tie his shoes. Her voice, usually harsh and impatient, had been strangely soft that day. She called him Solnishko, which I later found out means sunshine in Russian. It stunned me at the time, because I had never heard her speak Russian. She insisted she didn't speak any language other than English. So how had she learned that word? And why? Back then, I'd filed it away as one of the many contradictions that made Margaret so inscrutable. But standing there on the rooftop, that memory felt like a clue, a piece of the puzzle that might explain what she'd hidden all these years. If she was Russian, if she had ties to another culture or language, could that relate to how she came across the baby in a box? Or was it some small detail from her past that no one had ever pieced together? When I came back downstairs, James was slumped on the couch, the letter from Margaret crumpled in his fist. He looked so lost, I wasn't sure if anything could reach him. But I tried. I knelt in front of him, gently prying his fingers away from the wrinkled paper. "We need to see if any of what she wrote is true," I said softly. He just stared at me, hollow-eyed. And so I moved forward on autopilot, calling the lab the lawyer recommended, setting up a DNA test. One part of me hoped it would confirm that Margaret was indeed his biological mother, that she had only lashed out in her final moments to hurt me. Another part of me dreaded the test might prove the letter right, that James was never her son by blood. The day the results arrived, we sat at the kitchen table under the fluorescent light. The children, Sophie and Lizzie, were at a friend's house for a sleepover. I was grateful. I couldn't bear them seeing their father in this state. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope. James clenched his jaw so tight I could see a vein throbbing at his temple. The words burned into my vision. 0% match. No shared markers. No genetic link. James was biologically unrelated to Margaret. He swallowed hard and stared at the letters on the page, ice flicking back and forth as if searching for an alternative meaning. "I'm nobody," he finally said, voice hollow. Everything I knew was a lie. All the stories about how her father was a fisherman, how I inherited his love for the sea. It was all nonsense. She spun a life around me that never existed. I reached out, cradling his face in my hands. I could feel the stubble on his cheeks, the tension in his jaw. "Don't you dare say you're nobody," I whispered fiercely. "You're the man who stayed up all night when Sophie had pneumonia, rocking her back and forth until she breathed easier. You're the father who danced at Lizzie's ballet recital, even though your foot was broken, just so she'd have someone there. You're the husband who works 2 jobs to keep this family afloat. That's who you are." Tears welled in his eyes and he shook his head, pulling me into a desperate embrace. I pressed Psalm 121 into his hand, the small card Margaret used to keep in her Bible. "Maybe her words were wrong," I murmured, "but the psalm was always right. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore." It doesn't say that God only watches over the children we birth. It doesn't say you have to be tied by blood to be worthy of care. Family is who shows up. Family is who loves. He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks, and I could see the faintest glimmer of hope in his eyes, like a candle flame flickering in a dark room. But the questions lingered. If Margaret had found James in a cardboard box, was there more to the story? What had driven her to take him, especially if she couldn't have children after some awful beatings? And how did Russia, or the Russian word I remembered her using, tie into all this? A few days later, we started the painful process of sorting through Margaret's belongings in the old house she left behind. The place looked as though it had been frozen in time, the doilies collecting dust, her porcelain figurines lined up on the mantel. With every box we opened, we half expected to stumble on more secrets, more letters, more revelations. But mostly, we found the usual remnants of a life. Clothing she never wore, books with her notes in the margins, stacks of newspapers that she kept for reasons no one understood. Then, while rummaging through a hall closet, I noticed a loose floorboard. The gap was subtle, but enough to catch my eye. Curious, I pried it up and discovered a small shoebox tucked away beneath the floor. My heart rate soared. Inside, there was a baby blanket, worn and frayed, a small silver rattle, and a note, written in what I recognized as Cyrillic characters. Though I couldn't read it, the handwriting looked shaky, uncertain. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. This must be connected to James's true origins. "James!" I called. Voice hushed. He came over, gingerly lifting the items from the shoebox. The blanket was soft, dyed pale blue. The rattle had a small inscription on it, but the letters were too faded to read. The note was definitely not in English. "We need a translator," I said, my voice trembling with anticipation. We called our neighbor, Kathy, who had studied Russian in college. She came over, took one look at the note, and read it aloud in English. "Forgive me, James. I stole you from that box. I was selfish. Be better than me." Silence filled the room. My ears buzzed. Kathy looked at us, uncertain if she should say something more. Finally, she placed the note gently on the table and excused herself, giving us space to process what we'd just heard. James sank onto a chair, the baby blanket clutched in his hands. Tears slid down his face as he stared at the shaky words. "She admitted it," he whispered. "She stole me. All those times she hinted at a violent past, how she couldn't have children after the beatings. I always assumed it was my father who beat her, but maybe it was someone else. Maybe someone back in Russia. And she thought if she couldn't have a child, she had to take one. But she still cared for you," I murmured gently. "She still raised you as her own, even if she did it in a twisted, controlling way. This note, it sounds like guilt. Maybe she was trying, in her broken way, to say she was sorry." His face crumpled. "She was so cruel to me sometimes, Anna. She'd make me feel worthless, like she was the only one who would ever care about me. And she hated you because she thought you'd take me away. But maybe deep down, she knew you were better for me, that you'd show me the kind of love she never could." I placed a hand over his. Perhaps her hatred toward me was fueled by fear. She took you in and made you her son, but she was so afraid of losing you that she built walls of spite around her own heart. And you suffered for it." He nodded, tears still streaming. "She did try to love me. I remember a few kind moments, like the time she was teaching me to tie my shoes. She called me Sonishko, her sunshine. I don't even know if she was fluent in Russian, but sometimes she'd slip a word in, and I felt so special for that moment, like I was her world. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, letting the magnitude of Margaret's secrets wash over us. As strange as it sounded, it felt like a deeper kind of grief. We weren't just mourning her death. We were mourning the illusions that had sustained James's life. Yet amid the grief, I sensed a bizarre kind of hope. Now we had the truth, however twisted. And the truth, while painful, could set James free from the question that had tormented him for weeks. Who am I? In the days that followed, we spoke with the lawyer again. The DNA test confirmed that James was not Margaret's biological child, so the estate would skip over him and go to our daughters. We had to do some legal maneuvering to ensure they got what was rightfully theirs, but ironically, Emily's smug satisfaction was short-lived. She'd wanted to see James suffer, but she hadn't anticipated that the estate being withheld from James didn't mean it fell to her. The grandchildren, our children, would inherit it, though it was a cumbersome process to get everything in place, yet money was the least of our worries. We were more concerned with healing the gaping wound in our family's sense of identity. James started seeing a therapist, a gentleman named Doctor Roland, who specialized in adoption and identity issues. Though it was Margaret's deception, James was the one left with the trauma of not knowing his origins. Slowly, he began to reconcile that the woman he'd known as a harsh, at times unloving mother had still chosen him when no one else would. It was a complicated sort of gratitude, laced with bitterness and regret. As we navigated these tumultuous waters, I leaned heavily on my faith. For many nights, after tucking Sophie and Lissy into bed, I would sit at the kitchen table with my Bible open to Psalm 121, reading and rereading its promises, that the Maker of heaven and earth is our helper, that he does not slumber nor sleep, that he watches over our coming and going. Sometimes those words were the only thread keeping me from unraveling. Other times, they felt distant and hollow, like a promise meant for someone else. One Sunday morning, while James was still sleeping, I made a pot of coffee and stared out the window as the sunlight crept across the windowsill. The city looked unusually serene. The old doubt tugged at me. Where was God in all this chaos? Then I remembered the fleeting moment on the rooftop, screaming into the wind, feeling no immediate answer. But maybe the answer wasn't in a thunderous reply. Maybe it was in the small ways we were piecing our life back together. In the tears James cried that gave way to acceptance. In the subtle shift of perspective that family isn't always about blood. Perhaps God's help had come in ways we didn't expect. Through an ugly letter that forced the truth out into the open. Or through a bitter ex-mistress whose spite revealed hidden documents. A month or so later, the church invited me to speak at a Sunday service dedicated to testimonies of hope. The same church where Margaret's funeral had taken place felt like a strange venue for me to share anything so personal, but something compelled me to accept. As I stepped onto the podium, I felt a jolt of déjà vu, recalling Margaret's casket in that very spot, the stained glass windows weeping with rain. Today, the sun streamed through the glass, painting the pews in vibrant reds and blues. I clutched the edges of the wooden podium. My notes were scribbled in the margin of my Bible, but I spoke from my heart. Help doesn't always come from where we expect, I began, voice quivering slightly. Sometimes it climbs out of a cardboard box. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a letter so cruel we think it can only harm us. And sometimes... I paused, glancing at James, who sat in the front row, eyes shining. It's a lie that finally sets you free. The congregation was silent, each face reflecting empathy, curiosity, or surprise. I continued, explaining how James had learned of his true origins, how it shook our family to the core, and how we still found solace in Psalm 121. The psalm says, "I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from?" I used to think that help was an immediate rescue, a miracle that comes just when you need it. But maybe sometimes it's a journey, a painful climb up the mountain of our own fears and illusions. And when we get to the top, we realize the help was there all along, guiding us through. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. I expected a wave of pity or shocked silence, but instead I was met with understanding nods, with people bowing their heads in silent prayer. After the service, many approached us, offering hugs, words of encouragement, and stories of their own family secrets, their own struggles to find identity in a world that often feels random. That afternoon, James and I walked outside the church, hand in hand. The sunlight felt warm against my skin, so different from the biting rain on the day of Margaret's funeral. The girls ran around us in circles, giggling about how they would one day buy a pony with the inheritance from Grandma Margaret. I couldn't help but laugh, tears mingling with my smile. In that moment, I let myself feel gratitude for the secrets unearthed, for the truths revealed, and for a future that felt strangely brighter, even though the mountains were certainly still there. Over the next weeks, James continued to process his grief. Therapy sessions helped, but he also sought out information about his own background, even going so far as to track down the old liquor store that had been mentioned in the newspaper clipping. The store was still there, albeit under different ownership. The new owner had no records dating back so many years, but he did recall hearing a local urban legend about a mysterious baby found one cold winter night. As James asked questions, he realized that even if he never found his biological mother, he could at least piece together fragments of the circumstances that led him to that box. At night, we would talk about what we learned, recounting every small detail. Over time, those details lost their power to injure. Instead, they became stepping stones, leading us into acceptance and peace. We'd lie in bed, the lamp casting soft light on the pages of our Bibles or notebooks, and we'd wonder at the providence that had shaped our family. What if Margaret hadn't found me? James would muse. What if she hadn't been driving by that night? I couldn't help but see a strange strand of fate, or maybe grace, in it all. Then we wouldn't be here, I'd reply. And I wouldn't have fallen in love with you. And we wouldn't have Sophie and Lizzie. It was humbling to realize that even Margaret's hardened heart had been used to create this life we treasured, in some paradoxical way. Her brokenness was the soil from which our family grew. A few months after Margaret's funeral, we decided to do some light renovations on her old house to ready it for sale or rental. Stepping into that house still gave me chills, but with each day spent painting walls or fixing creaking floors, the place felt less like Margaret's fortress and more like a neutral space. One afternoon, while cleaning out a closet, I stumbled upon a ratty old photo album. My heart kicked into overdrive as I flipped through the pages. Many were pictures of James as a small child. His birthdays, Christmas mornings, trips to the park. Margaret appeared in some of them, her face unreadable, but occasionally there was a glimmer of warmth. A hand resting softly on his shoulder. A hint of a smile. At the very back of the album, tucked behind a loose plastic sleeve, I found a single Polaroid. It was dark, but I could make out the shape of a cardboard box in an alley and a woman, Margaret, leaning over it. It must have been taken by someone else, maybe a passerby or a friend. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakably a pivotal moment. The instant Margaret discovered baby James. Seeing that raw, tangible proof, I felt both heartbreak and awe. Margaret was younger then, her hair a darker shade, her expression intense, and in that snapshot, I could sense the flicker of something akin to love, or at least desperation. I showed it to James, and he stared at it for a long time, tears shimmering in his eyes. "She kept it," he said, voice trembling. "She always told me the first time she saw me was the happiest moment of her life. But then she turned right around and..." He broke off, struggling with the duality of his memories. "Maybe she loved you in the only way she could," I offered. "It was imperfect, even toxic at times, but she still made the choice that night to pick you up, to take you home, to feed you, to raise you." He nodded, tears escaping. "I wish she could have apologized when she was alive. I wish she hadn't blamed you all those years. But at least I have this proof that she did, in her own twisted way, care." He carefully placed the Polaroid back in the album, as though returning a relic to its sacred place. Not long after, we finally finished clearing out Margaret's house. We placed the shoebox and the photo album in a special trunk that James keeps in his study. He said he wants to show them to Sophie and Lissy when they're older, to explain their grandmother's complicated legacy. I supported that. Secrets lose their power when they're brought into the light. On a final visit to the house, I lingered in Margaret's bedroom, the place where I'd first found the letter. Dust motes floated in the late afternoon sun. The bed, stripped of linens, looked stark and cold. I felt a wave of sadness for the woman who'd spent her last days in that space, alone and angry, yet compelled to write one last letter that would change all our lives. I whispered a quiet goodbye. Despite everything, I found a measure of compassion for her. Maybe it was the looming absence of her presence, or maybe it was the knowledge that sometimes even the most broken among us harbor small acts of love. As we locked the door, I realized I was leaving that place lighter than when I'd entered it. We had discovered truths that hurt us deeply, but they also propelled us forward toward an honest relationship with ourselves and each other. Margaret's final gift was a twisted one, but it was a gift nonetheless. It allowed James to confront his identity and redefine himself, not as a victim or a man bound by the illusions of a bitter woman, but as the father, husband, and friend we all knew him to be. On the Sunday that concluded this chapter of our lives, the church was filled with sunlight once more. I volunteered to read the day's scripture, choosing, unsurprisingly, Psalm 121. My voice echoed in the sanctuary. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. The words resonated in me now, no longer tasting of ash, but of a quiet, sustaining promise. I glanced at James in the front row. Our eyes met, and he mouthed, "I love you." I continued reading. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. My thoughts flickered to that cardboard box in a dark alley and a woman who, despite her many flaws, didn't let James slip away into oblivion. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. Perhaps God placed James in that box at exactly the right time, on the right night, for Margaret to pass by. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. I pictured all the nights James stayed up to comfort our daughters, the love that has overshadowed every wound life had inflicted on him. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. When the service ended, we stepped outside into a glorious day. The sky was a brilliant blue, and white clouds drifted lazily above the steeple. As we walked home, hand in hand, we talked about the future. We talked about how James wanted to do a search, no longer out of desperation, but curiosity, about his biological mother. Perhaps she was still alive somewhere, or perhaps not. But it no longer felt like a question that haunted him. Instead, it was an open possibility he could explore on his own terms. We also laughed about simpler things. Lissy's new obsession with ballet, Sophie's determination to become an astronaut. Life felt ordinary and extraordinary at the same time, colored by a deeper appreciation for how fragile and precious it all was. That night, as the children slept and the city hummed in the distance, I sat on the windowsill with James, our legs dangling. He looked out at the horizon, where Manhattan skyscrapers twinkled like 1,000 silent beacons. "The mountains are still there," he said softly, referencing the metaphor of the psalm. "There will always be challenges, big or small." I rested my head on his shoulder. "But now we know we can climb them," I replied, echoing the line I once whispered to myself in a moment of desperate prayer. And if we stumble, we have each other. We always have help, even if it doesn't come in the form we expected. He nodded, smiling, and together we watched the lights dance across the night sky. In my heart, I felt the stirring of genuine peace. We had faced Margaret's darkest secret, survived Emily's venom, and come to understand that family isn't confined to bloodlines. Family is who shows up for you, who cries with you, who picks you up from the cardboard boxes life leaves you in. It's the person who hates you, yet still takes you in. The spouse who refuses to let your identity collapse under the weight of betrayal. the children who inherit both the blessings and the curses of their ancestry, but who choose love anyway. We might never fully unravel the complexities of Margaret's past. We might never know who beat her so badly that she was unable to have children, or what truly compelled her to take that baby from the box. But the note she left behind, shaky Cyrillic, pleading for forgiveness, was enough to tell us she was haunted by her own regrets. Maybe, in her final days, she hoped to unburden her conscience by revealing the truth. The letter she wrote me was filled with malice, but even malice can lead to revelation. And so this is my story. A story of how a grave secret ripped open my family's life, how it threatened to consume us with bitterness, and how, through the words of an ancient psalm, we found the courage to climb the mountains ahead. It's a story of heartbreak and healing, of a child once abandoned, then stolen, and then loved, in the only twisted way his mother knew how. It's a story of how that same child became the most tender-hearted father I could ever have dreamed for my own children. And it's a story of how I, the daughter-in-law she hated most, discovered that help does indeed come, but often from the most unexpected places. Not every question has been answered, and not every wound has been healed. But as I sit here, recounting these events, I feel a warmth in my chest that I can only describe as hope. The words of Psalm 121 echo softly in my mind. I lift my eyes to the mountains, but I no longer see them as impossible barriers. They are challenges, yes, and they loom large on the horizon of every life. Yet I know now that my help comes from the Maker of heaven and earth, and He does not abandon us to our sorrows. He walks with us, even when the path is obscured by rain, or overshadowed by the ghost of a woman who once harbored such spite. He guides us, even when the only clue is a single word in a foreign language, whispered in a moment of tenderness. And so we climb, step by tremulous step, learning that on the other side of betrayal lies understanding, and on the other side of hatred lies a complicated love. If Margaret taught me anything, it's that life is rarely clean or straightforward. But if we keep our eyes lifted, if we remember we're not alone, we can ascend the steepest slopes. And maybe, just maybe, at the summit, we'll find a peace that surpasses all the hurts we've carried. That's where our story rests now, not in tidy closure, but in the ongoing process of healing. Because help really does come, sometimes from the very cardboard box we fear is empty, and sometimes in the quiet hush of a God who never sleeps, who watches over our going out and our coming in, both now and forevermore.